Welcome everybody to the presentation by the Vice President and Chief Economist at California Association of Realtors, Jordan Levine. Now, before we get into that, we have Mary from Cali Building who's sponsoring the event. Mary?
Good morning, y'all. You may recognize this place. I'm down here at the board. We're here for the affiliates meeting this morning, planning for next year for y'all. And we are proud to be an affiliate and working to support the agents here in locally. And we count it a privilege. I wanted to share with you that John has now added a new tool to his belt. He is now doing sewer scans. He is certified. And as y'all know, any home that is 20 years or older, it is recommended to do a sewer scan, or if they have cast iron pipes, that is recommended. So we will be helping doing this. We've in the past we have subcontracted that. We are no longer subcontracting it because my husband is now certified to do that. So I'm very proud of him for pushing through and learning that and going to school for that. And the cost for it is $250. That is without a home inspection. But if you're doing it with a home inspection, it's $125. And I just want to say thank you for allowing us to be a part of this and being an affiliate. And we will be giving away, we normally do like a gift card to Amazon or a food gift card. Well, we're going to do something different for y'all this time. Since gas is so expensive, y'all, we're going to give y'all, whoever the 17th person is, we are going to be giving away a Chevron gift card for $100, and you can use that. All righty. Y'all have a good day. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of this.
Thank you so much, Mary.
You're welcome, Scott.
All righty. So Jordan Levine is the Vice President and Chief Economist for the California Association of Realtors. Jordan is responsible for C.A.R's housing market and economic research, as well as the policy analysis for C.A.R's legislative and governmental affairs efforts. He has a passion for home ownership, is actively involved in the company's diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and regularly represents C.A.R. to its members, the real estate industry, policymakers, and in the local and national media. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Jordan Levine.
Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you to Cindy and John and Mary for sponsoring this event. I'm excited to be able to roll out the new forecast, and I brought some local data too to kind of see how this is all playing out in our neck of the woods. So let me go ahead and share my slides so that I don't traumatize you all too bad, and we can look at some pictures, which I think tell us a lot about what we can expect coming down the pike. I thought the best place to start, given that this is my first year on the job, is to start where my former boss / mentor, predecessor, and icon, Leslie Appleton Young, always started. And that was with what she called a cadence of accountability. And really what she meant was to show you how we did on last year's forecast, right? So that you know how much stock to put into what I'm about to tell you. And if you go back to the forecast that we delivered back in, I guess October of 2020, we were expecting that sales were going to go up this year by a little bit, about 3.3%. We also thought prices were going to continue going up after a pretty solid year last year by a little bit, a 1.3% increase to about $650,000. Well, excuse me, unfortunately, that forecast was pretty much dead on arrival, because at the time we delivered it, we were coming down off a pretty significant surge in the public health crisis during the summer. Things had looked like they were going to start going back to normal. And of course, in about mid-November, we saw a huge surge in the COVID-19 numbers, which led to further lockdowns on the economy, actually reinvigorated the housing market, which is something that we've seen pretty consistently throughout the course of this crisis, is that when things get worse on the public health front, you kind of get this renewed passion for home ownership and this surge in housing demand. And in fact, that's exactly what we saw during the final quarter of last year. And so right off the bat, 2020 actually ended up coming in much stronger than what we were even projecting back in October of that year. So we ended the year at almost 412,000 units in terms of closed sales statewide. We had prices that didn't go up by 8%. They instead went up by 11.5%, right? And so coming into 2021 on a much stronger tailwind than what we were originally projecting, again, largely on the basis of such a strong final quarter of the year. And so when you look at our projections for where we're actually going to end this year compared to what we actually forecast, we think that the year is going to come in with about twice as much growth in closed transactions, almost a 7% increase. And that's from a higher base to begin with, right? So we're going to end up with about 440,000 home sales compared to the 395,000 or so that we had originally forecast for this year. Similarly, where we, I think, really missed the boat was on the price stuff, right? Because if you look at our forecast for prices, we, went up way beyond what the original forecast was. Growth of expected about 20% this year, a little bit more than 20%, to a median statewide price of almost $800,000. And so if you kind of take a step back, I'd probably give us about a C- on last year's forecast. We had the directions correct, right? We had sales going up. We had prices continuing to go up as well. But really where we missed the boat was on just that kind of resurgence of housing demand in the final quarter of the year that really sent prices in particular soaring way higher than what we had originally expected when we were seeing a kind of normalized market. And that's why it's, in some ways the kind of story is more important than the actual point estimate that I'm about to deliver. And I think when you ask me about the forecast for next year, right, you're really asking me a couple of questions, one of which is just kind of what's happening with the broader economy, right? Is that kind of macroeconomic tide going to be rising? And although we do see, various sources of uncertainty, particularly in the kind of global economic environment, whether it's China, the Chinese housing market, what's going on with debt defaults on huge developers like Evergrande, energy prices, even domestically, things like inflation, outside of some unforeseen shock, we're pretty optimistic about where things are headed from an economic perspective. We see jobs continuing to be added back. We have incomes starting to rise gradually, which will hopefully lead to more growth and recovery in our Main Street economy via consumer spending, right, at retailers, restaurants, et cetera. We might even start to see, I think, some of those life events that are kind of predicated on a good economy, a lot of those life changes that really spur housing choice changes, like getting married, having babies, getting divorced, getting kicked out of your mom's house, what have you. We think those will start to happen as well as the kind of, effects of the pandemic start to wane and the economy continues to recover. Of course, we also, need to know not just about that broader economic climate, but also about the kind of housing market in particular, right? Because we've kind of been the bright spot in the broader economic environment for the entirety of the recovery, right? And so punching above our weight in many ways. Sales, we expect to remain relatively solid. Prices, we think, will continue to go up. And the market's still pretty competitive, but I think to really understand and have a good projection of where the housing market's going to go this year, we also need to kind of take stock of what changes that have been ushered in as a result of this crisis are going to persist into the future, and what areas we're already starting to see things not necessarily go back to normal, but where those changes seem more transitory in nature and where things are starting at least to look more like they did before the crisis than they did during the peak of the crisis. And we know that there was a big impact, and I'll show you some of the numbers from last year, that there really was a kind of shock-induced flavor to the nature of that surge in buyer demand that we've been experiencing. And I think that the key as we look forward is thinking about how those changes are going to intersect with our pre-existing conditions, if you will, those structural changes that we've been battling with here in California for decades. Because I think in some ways, what this crisis, the kind of lasting impact of this crisis won't be that it completely changed everything about the way we do stuff. Yes, we see some persistent remote working, right? We do see that retail in particular will kind of have persistent negative impacts because we've gotten so comfortable buying stuff online in sweatpants from our couch and whatnot. But what it's really done is kind of accelerated, made more urgent the kind of pre-existing structural challenges that California has already been facing. And of course, I want to talk a little bit while I have you here as a captive audience about what it all means for you, right? Because in some ways, even though we're optimistic about the broader economy, even though we're relatively optimistic about the housing market continuing to move forward, I think at the individual realtor level, at the individual real estate practitioner level, it's still very much a foot on the accelerator type of environment despite that, because there's those structural issues which we'll touch on, don't just impact our clients in terms of, preventing us from closing the gap on home ownership with the rest of the United States, from improving on housing affordability. It also has kind of pocketbook implications for us as realtors. And I think that is very much something that we want to be cognizant of, even as the kind of broader 30,000 foot perspective is one that's relatively optimistic. Moral of the story, I think, yes, the cyclical issues are starting to fade. But again, those structural issues are kind of reasserting themselves, and in some ways have been made more urgent by the nature of this crisis. So just nose to the grindstone is kind of the moral of the story there. But let's talk about the broader economy, right? Because there is a lot to be optimistic about just in terms of those kind of broader conditions being supportive of further recovery and expansion of the housing market. First and foremost is on the public health side, and these are numbers through, I guess, Friday would be the 29th, I guess. And what you can see is that we've made both significant and pretty sustained progress after a surge during the summer. These numbers are looking good, right? We're moving in the right direction, and that's been the case fairly consistently. Of course, this is the thing that we completely missed the boat on last year, and what really drove that surge in sales and prices that we had through the last 3-4 months of the year. But overall, these numbers look pretty good. I keep these as a wild card because if you look at where we are just kind of chronologically in the calendar, we're right in the pit of where we were last year, right? When we were coming down off a surge in the public health numbers, things were looking like the economy was going to start normalizing. About a week after I delivered the forecast, we saw COVID rise to levels that we had never seen before. We don't think that's going to happen this time around. We're in a much different environment than we were back then, just in terms of folks, shots in arms, all of that kind of stuff. But I'd be lying to you if I said that this was my particular area of expertise. And so we will keep an eye on this for, as a potential wild card. But so far, so good, right? Moving in the right direction. These numbers are actually encouraging for the first time in many, many months. And that's already led itself to some, pretty significant progress on the economic front, right? This is where the rubber meets the road. These are jobs in California. And what you can see is that, we had last year one of the biggest and most unprecedented shocks to our economy in recorded history. Between February and April of last year, we actually lost 2.7 million jobs from our non-farm payrolls here in California. That's basically overnight by statistical standards. And yet you can see that even though we hadn't started to really reopen the economy in any meaningful way in May and June of that year, we were starting to get our arms wrapped around how to operate during the crisis, right? We got some rules of the road, as it were, when it comes to, how to sell homes and things like that. We got our arms wrapped around social distancing, masking, how to kind of operate in a pandemic environment. And with the exception of that huge spike in coronavirus that I showed you from November to January of last year, the jobs numbers have generally been trending up. In fact, and although we don't have October numbers here for another couple of weeks, even through September, which we just got from the state, we had already added back through the end of September about 1.7 million of the 2.7 million jobs that we lost. So we're still about 1 million jobs shy of where we were in February, right? Short of that kind of pre-crisis level. And we probably still need about 500,000 or so more jobs on top of that, just to get back, not to where we were, but to those long run trend lines where we should have been, but for the effects of this crisis. But when you kind of crunch all the numbers on that, what it means is that we're about 55 to 60% of the way towards full economic recovery and moving in that direction on a fairly consistent basis, right? You can see if you kind of look at that recovery spread out geographically, you can see Bakersfield is kind of down on the lower end of the spectrum. Fresno to the north is a little bit higher up in terms of jobs recovered. Keep in mind, though, especially when we're talking about Bakersfield, we had one of the smallest declines in employment recorded during the state. We were down about 11.8% compared to as high as 20% in some of these really kind of tourist heavy areas like Napa and Monterey, et cetera, right? Marin County, all up in the 20s. So more or less on that same kind of broad statewide trend towards full economic recovery, with a little bit smaller of a hole to climb out of ultimately than what we saw in other parts of the state. If you kind of look at that 2.7 million jobs lost, not by geography, but instead you divide it up by industry, the strength of the housing market starts to make a lot more sense, because when you look at it from a kind of demographic standpoint, the job losses, the kind of brunt of the crisis was borne by these kind of non-remotable face-to-face jobs. And what I've done here is I've called out the 4 lowest paying industries in California in red and the 4 highest paying industries in green. And what you can see again is that those kind of low wage, face-to-face, non-remotable jobs were the ones that really took it on the chin. You're talking about almost 1 million jobs just from leisure and hospitality. That's your bars, your restaurants, your hotels, et cetera, your retail stores, right? Your Main Street retailers. Other services is where all of our kind of personal services and personal care, your barbers, your stylists, your nail salons, your dry cleaners, et cetera, and those administrative workers that are needed across all sectors. Those really were about 90% more or less of the jobs that were lost in California, whereas the 4 highest paying industries, right, your professional workers, your financial folks, your folks who work in management, information, which is like software publishing, internet service providers, et cetera, were much more insulated from the effects of this crisis. And if you kind of think about California's housing market, even before COVID, right, that the high wage sectors were the ones that were really sourcing, supplying, if you will, all of the home buyers in California. And so these were the folks that were kind of relatively unaffected by the crisis, and that intersected perfectly with the fact that we our homes were more important to us than ever before, right? Our CEO, Joel Singer, calls it the value of home, right? Which was just kind of dramatically increased specifically because of the nature of this crisis. Typically, the housing market goes the same way as the economy, but here you had a negative shock to the economy that actually invigorated the housing market because these kind of folks with the financial wherewithal to be able to become homeowners remained employed at a much higher rate. In fact, in some cases, they were doing even better than ever financially because they weren't commuting, they weren't paying for parking, et cetera, et cetera. And they needed their homes to do so much more for them, right? It was where you lived, worked, played, did all that stuff. It was your kid's classroom, your gym, all of that stuff. And And so that kind of really, kind of was a perfect storm, as it were, for housing demand, especially in the context of remote work, right? Where most of these kind of high wage insulated workers were able to take their laptops and continue working from some other part of the state. And that really unlocked a lot of options when it came to home buyer demand, right? And so that kind of was the trifecta: the relative economic outperformance, right? The kind of flexibility, and then this renewed passion for home ownership that really did create this kind of perfect storm for housing demand. And of course, we can't overstate the impact of low interest rates too, right? Because we took that trifecta just in terms of motivating factors for home buyers and threw it into the pot with mortgage rates, which started this year at 2.65%, which is an all-time low. And it was we were coming into this year just on an incredible tailwind from a home buying standpoint, right? And even as we've seen the last 3-4 weeks in a row, those interest rates start to rise a little bit. In fact, we're above 3% according to the Freddie Mac survey last week, right? But I always like to take this 1-year chart on interest rates that I'm showing you here, and then zoom it out to the 50-year chart on interest rates to kind of illustrate the point that rates are still very, very low by historical standards, not by the standards of where they were at the beginning of this year, but by the standards of pretty much any other time in history outside of that. I remind you that I'm still the son of a guy who in the early 80s used to walk around bragging about his 12.5% mortgage interest rate. And I think from that standpoint, rates are still going to be a tailwind when it comes to housing demand, as it has been, frankly, up to this point. And we've seen that has really materialized, right? The perfect storm for demand showed up in terms of closed transactions. And these are numbers from December, and just go with me here. I know these are dated, but I want to show you where we were last year a little bit so that we can kind of set the stage for where we are right now, and then talk about where we're going from here, because it kind of tells a tale, if you will. So bear with me and trust me as we go through the last year's stuff, because we ended December at a 15-year high for closed transactions, right? We were at almost 510,000 units on an annualized basis. That means that we actually ended the year up 3.5% in terms of closed sales. So even despite basically pressing pause on the housing market during March, April, and May of last year, California more than made up for that lost ground during the second half of the year, clawing all of those losses back and then some, to again end with 3.5% more home sales than we had even in 2019, when we were at all-time low levels of unemployment, no pandemic, and still rates that were pretty low, especially by my dad's standards. And that's why even in the middle of winter, right, in December, we were setting what were at that time all-time high prices, right? $720,000, which doesn't normally happen in December, right? The housing market's usually pretty quiet in the winter, ramps up in the spring, and we even fell to all-time low levels of inventory in December, just 1.3 months of supply out there on MLSs. But what you can see is that last year that demand was really impacted in terms of the kind of 5 W's of housing demand. We saw that there was this kind of shock-induced shape to it, right, or flavor to it. And we know that when we did our 2021 kind of consumer survey, we asked whether the pandemic impacted your timing decision on when to buy a home, right? And these are all home buyers over the last 12 months. Half of them said no, right, that I bought when I was originally planning to. But half said that yes, their decision on when to buy was impacted. In some cases, 23% of cases, they said that it delayed their decision, right? They were impacted by coronavirus. They weren't sure what was going to happen. They decided to wait and see. But the really interesting thing to me, which I think does kind of underscore what Joel Singer called the value of home, is that 1 out of 4 of these home buyers we talked to said they bought sooner than they would have because of COVID, right? And to me, that really does just highlight, that kind of renewed passion for home ownership. It also is interesting that it not just impacted their decision on when to buy, it also impacted their decision on what to buy, right? So of those kind of 50% of folks that said that they changed their timeline, 61% of those respondents also said it changed what they wanted to buy in terms of the house that they were going to buy, and the kind of the factors ran the gamut from size to product type to location, et cetera. But you can really see from these 1,000 or so consumers that we talked to that there was, and these were home buyers last year, that there was this kind of pandemic shaped nature to, or at least it was there influencing their decision. And in fact, if you look at it from a geographic standpoint last year, excuse me, and I talked about how California ended 2020 up 3.5%. We had 20 cities last year that ended the year up 40% at least from where they were in 2019. Excuse me. And if you kind of go through and categorize these cities, I would argue that they fall into one of two general categories, right? They're either your very high costs, affluent luxury markets, your Malibus in LA, your Montecitos in Santa Barbara, Tiburon in the Bay Area, Rancho Santa Fe down in San Diego, or they're kind of your high quality of life / resort markets that don't, boast particularly large employment centers, but are markets that folks really love to live. And kind of what we saw was that this kind of opportunistic outmigration, I would call it, of these kind of, relatively insulated, high wage earners drove a lot of demand in places like Big Bear, in places like Lake Arrowhead, in Tahoe, South Lake Tahoe, Arnold, right? Places like the Sierra Nevada foothills, places like Tehachapi, right, which did exceptionally well last year, places like Indian Wells in the Palm Springs area, right? And you see Rancho Marietta up by Sacramento. These are kind of, the common theme there is that they're all great places to live without a ton of jobs. Course Gold, exactly, Karina. And what you saw was, again, I think this kind of opportunistic out-migration creating a surge in sales in some of these markets that weren't previously kind of hotbeds for remote work activity. You can kind of see the same story played out if you look not by geography, but instead by size of home, right? And if you look at the kind of data for the preceding couple of years leading up to the crisis, the numbers were incredibly stable. The median square footage of a home purchased in California stayed about plus or minus 2%, around 1,740 square feet for almost 99% of the time. And yet you can see almost overnight with the onset of the crisis, as we opened up the market in May and June, that number jumped up. And this is a median number, right? So there was enough purchasing or closing of bigger homes to drag the entire median north by about 90 to 100 square feet, which to my mind is about the size of a home office, right? We're talking about a 10 by 10 square foot room. And so it didn't just impact where folks were buying, right? With places like Tehachapi and Course Gold and things like that really skyrocketing last year. They were also going out and buying bigger homes. So you can kind of, again, see the kind of pandemic induced nature where folks had to work remotely. They needed space for their kids to homeschool. They needed a separate place to do a Zoom meeting so that their partner could do a Zoom meeting and they aren't like kind of stepping on each other's toes and all of that stuff. You can see the same kind of thing played out if you look at it by product type, right? And this is just through the reopening of the housing market. So it ends in June of 2020. But I just wanted to show you how at the onset of the crisis, when single family homes were falling by 30 and 40%, condos, which tend to be, kind of congregated in those dense employment centers, which tend to be smaller in size, right? Those those sales were falling by 40 and 60%. So falling much faster than what you saw in terms of the single family. So these all kind of help to tell us the story that there was this kind of pandemic induced shape or flavor to the housing demand that we saw last year. So we had that surge, but it was kind of an atypical nature of demand. One of the things that we've seen consistently too is that these were folks who were long-term renters that were finally getting their foot on the property ladder. Last year, we were at a 10-year high in our annual housing market survey for the percentage of the market that was first-time buyers, over 37%. And even though that came down a little bit in this year's survey, we're still at 35.5%, near a decade high. So it did motivate a lot of these long-term renters, frankly, relatively affluent renters, to finally seek that kind of or fulfill that American dream, I guess, of getting their foot on the property ladder, especially with the convergence of, that increased flexibility, that renewed passion, those low rates, and probably a little bit of all of the above, really drove these folks to again, finally make that leap into home ownership. When you look at who these folks were, and again, I think if you interpret this data through the lens of the kind of broader economy and the kind of economic outperformance of high income earners throughout this crisis, what you can see is that these were the relatively affluent long-term renters. So we had a lot of first-time buyers coming into the market, but they were these folks in these kind of high-wage industries with that financial wherewithal, and kind of economic insulation from the crisis that allowed them to take advantage of those low rates, to, that kind of put them in a position to have flexibility because they're in a remotable job. And we saw for the second year in a row here that about 1 out of 3 of those first-time buyers was coming into the housing market for the first time with at least 20% down, right? Which is pretty incredible. And again, just shows that the kind of the slice of the demographic that we were pulling in was these kind of folks who are at the top end of the income spectrum, which isn't necessarily super encouraging from a home ome standpoint, right? But it is, I think it does also kind of underscore and highlight that renewed passion that we saw for folks with the money to do so. Home ownership is kind of, they have a passion for it more now than they have in a very long time. If you think about it from a kind of systemic risk standpoint, right, for the brother-in-laws out there who tell you we're on the precipice of another foreclosure crisis, and just wait and buy a home next year because prices are about to drop and there's going to be all these REOs and stuff. Well, you can see here that this wasn't the kind of 0 down 5-1 option arm driven market, right? Those numbers were negligible in just straight up absolute terms, right? You're talking about less than 3% of the market this year, but certainly relative to where they were back in 2005, 6, and 7. And so, unfortunately, it wasn't this kind of middle class scrap your way into the housing market type of environment. These were folks who really did come in with the financial wherewithal to be able to take advantage of that perfect storm. And you see the same kind of thing in terms of income, right? You could see that if I showed you credit scores as well, right? You're talking about people who are getting into the market with 700 plus FICO scores. Same thing with income, right? The first-time home buyer, the median first-time home buyer last year came from a household that earned in excess of 6 figures, right? We're now talking about $110,000 a year. Households is the median first-time buyer. That means 50% of people who bought a home for the first time make more than $110,000 a year, and that number goes up when you look at repeat buyers. And so, a huge renewed passion for home ownership for those folks who are in the economic position to be able to fulfill that dream, which again, I think through the lens of the economy stuff and the jobs numbers that we talked about, makes perfect sense. The other thing I think that is really well explained by the broader economy, and why I, do it not just to justify my own student loans that I've been paying on for ages, but also because I think it does give us insights into the way that the housing market works, because we also see that the vacation and second home market continues to do very well. And this is the second year in a row where we had a significant increase in the percentage of the market that was in vacation and second home. So you didn't just have these kind of relatively affluent first-time buyers with high incomes and savings that worked at companies with high valuations and IPOs and all of that stuff. You also saw folks who already owned property in California going out and buying more property, right? That they wanted a place to ride out the quarantine. They wanted to get something that they could potentially put on Airbnb. They just wanted some space where they could go every now and then and enjoy themselves, because they are doing better financially and economically. And I think that, again, through the lens of an economy where the top end has really almost been unaffected, and in fact are now at new all-time highs for things like income and net wealth and home equity, et cetera, is also showing up in terms of the overall marketplace. And you see that if you look at growth in transactions here in California, subdivided out by price segment, what you can see is that, you know, the blue stuff, which is 2 million and up, has been head and shoulders above the rest of the market through the entirety of the recovery. And even as the market as a whole is now declining from where it was at this time last year, 2 million and up is still growing by almost 20% on a year-to-year basis, even as it grew about 70% on a year-over-year basis at the same time last year. In fact, we now sell more homes over $1 million than we sell homes under 500,000 here in California, which is also pretty scary from a kind of home ownership standpoint. But I think it does kind of illustrate how that kind of economic data intersects with the housing data to kind of create these outcomes that we're seeing in the marketplace. And I think that's why, you know, looking forward, even as we see a market that's starting to normalize, some markets are going to be more normal, I think, than others. And I think an Animal Farm reference is appropriate there. But, you know, you can see here through the 2021 numbers, and this is why I was setting you up with all the stuff from last year, is that here in 2021, through the first 9 months, we're still seeing growth in home sales, which I'm showing you across the bottom of the chart, be fastest in markets with the highest prices, right? So each one of these dots is a city in California, and the ones with higher prices tend to be the ones that are growing fastest. Those dots are generally upward trending, right, to the upper right-hand side, which means more growth in higher priced markets. In fact, if you just isolate the top 100 fastest growing cities, the top 100 fastest growing dots here on the left-hand side, 62% of those are markets with median price of at least $1 million. 20% or so are markets with median prices in excess of $2 million. And so those high income earners continue to do well, and that continues to drive an overperformance in the top end of the housing market. And we think that'll probably continue. There's nothing to suggest that high income earners are going to start doing worse than everyone else. If you look at it geographically, and I know nobody cares about this chart, but go with me because I'm going somewhere with this, and we'll zoom into the local stuff in a second, is that, you know, even as we see the top end of the market doing well, if you look at growth in transactions, and these are those 500 dots plotted out on a map, is that the green stuff, which are markets that are growing by 20, 30% or more, while the yellow is kind of 10 to 30%, red are markets that are shrinking. A lot of the growth is happening in the kind of core employment centers of California. You know, even in the Bay Area, certainly along the kind of core employment centers of the peninsula, the South Bay, the East Bay, Sacramento, the parts that are growing fastest is kind of like the core Sacramento proper market, right? And you can see the same thing playing out in Southern California. Yes, there's still growth in places like Palm Springs, Big Bear, but most of the growth that's happening in Southern California is also occurring in the kind of major employment corridors that are present there. And when you look at the kind of 30,000 foot regional data, California as a whole is up about 17% this year. But the areas that are really punching above their weight is the Bay Area, the Central Coast, and Southern California. And so even as we saw a lot of opportunistic out-migration last year, what you're seeing is that a lot of the demand is starting to go back to the core areas where it was before the crisis. And I think that's ultimately good news for the local market as well, right? If you look at Kern County, and the map now is showing days on market, right? Look at where days on market is the fiercest, right? It's in Bakersfield, proper, we're up 19.5% basically, which is faster than the statewide average. So even though the Central Valley as a whole was underperforming the state, our local market is actually doing well. And yes, you still see some pretty significant growth in Tehachapi, right, which is up 25% or so this year. You know, a lot of the kind of strength of the demand is right in Bakersfield proper. In fact, you know, what's really interesting to me is that you know, what's actually encouraging, and this is the second day in a row that I've seen this, because I did another outreach in in Sacramento yesterday, and I saw the same thing where you can see growth pretty much across the board on a zip code basis in Bakersfield, but I've sorted the zip codes from lowest price to highest priced on the right hand side. And what you can see is that not all of the growth is concentrated in, you know, 14, right, in the kind of almost $500,000 area of Bakersfield. In fact, some of the lower price, under $300,000 median price zip codes are the ones that are doing the best through the first 9 months of this year. And so to me, that's a hopeful sign that we're maybe on the leading edge of a trend that might, you know, show more normalization throughout the rest of the state next year, where the kind of entry level starts to kind of get its legs under itself as the economy normalizes again. And that's not necessarily something you see statewide. I just showed you how the top end is the one that's really doing the best in the rest of the state. This is something that I think is an emerging trend that's only starting to happen in places like Sacramento, Bakersfield, and a little bit lesser extent in Fresno as well. But again, if you look at even Fresno, right, the deepest red, the fastest time on market is still in the kind of core. Fresno's not doing as well as Bakersfield in terms of outperforming the state, but still growing by double digits through the first 9 months of the year. And to a lesser extent, that same kind of bucking of the kind of fastest growth being at the highest priced markets. And you can see that you know, some of the lower cost areas are doing pretty well in terms of growth this year in Fresno, even though those are fairly small volumes of transactions. But hopefully it gives me some optimism for the entry level of the market. Unfortunately, as we go back to normal, though, with, you know, homes kind of growing in the core, with sales growing in the core, with the entry level starting to come around, it probably means that we're not going to be able to hang on to those 15-year highs. You know, one of the downsides of having an inventory constrained market persist for so long is that initial kind of surge in optimism, and this is our consumer sentiment survey where we ask 1,000 consumers every month, how do you feel about buying a home? How do you feel about selling a home, right? And with the onset of the crisis, there was a surge in the percentage of folks out there in California who thought it was a good time to buy a home. That kind of value of home, that renewed passion for home ownership led the percentage of folks to say it was a good time to buy a home to increase pretty substantially. But you can see over the course of the last year, from basically July, August of last year onward, that inventory constraint where people were putting in offers, getting out competed, right? They were, you know, bidding on homes, not getting them, frankly. They were seeing other people come in with more money, with, you know, higher price offers, with more money down, with all cash, with, you know, willing to waive contingencies, what have you. That took its toll on the public zeitgeist. And we've kind of seen the percentage of folks who now think it's a good time to buy be cut in half. We have seen those numbers go up a little bit, and that's, I think, an area where we as real estate professionals kind of have some work to do to get buyers who may have been fatigued back into the game, because this does show up in terms of the actual buyer demand numbers, right? We've seen now for 23 weeks in a row, and these are mortgage applications, growth in mortgage applications on a year-to-year basis. And these are just purchase applications, by the way. So we already threw away all the refis, but those numbers have been shrinking now for 23 weeks in a row, right? We've had less buyers filling out mortgage applications to buy a home than we saw at this time last year. And unfortunately, that is also doing a pretty good job of predicting where C.A.R's weekly growth in transaction number is going, right? This is our index of where transactions are going week to week, right up through Halloween, shifted out by about the 6 weeks or so that it takes a mortgage application to actually turn into a closed sale. it's telling us that we can expect that a normal market means one with a lower level of sales than we saw, coming into the start of the year. We see that when we look at the MLS, right? There's fewer transactions going pending, and that's been true for the last 4 months in a row. And that's why, even as we see the market stabilizing above pre-crisis levels, right? In fact, we're kind of 5 to 7% higher than we were even in 2019, and we think we'll probably stay somewhere around that level. What you can see here is that we're not able to hang on to that 510,000 unit pace that we came into the year with, right? That a more normal market means that we have supply constraints that kind of tend to erode buyer demand at a certain point that prevent us from kind of maintaining 15-year highs indefinitely. The good news is sales aren't the only thing kind of reverting back to some semblance of normalcy. What you can see is that we've also started to add new listings. And I think this is something that you want to bring to the attention of those buyers who may have gotten fatigued, because even as we're still pretty depressed, even by the standards of 2018 and 19, which weren't great years, frankly, for housing inventory, but at least the green stuff here on the right-hand side, the number of active listings out there on the MLS has started to move in the right direction. And in fact, we didn't see that same seasonal decline in September that we normally see, which has me hopeful that maybe some of this pent-up supply from folks who've been waiting to sell their home because of the pandemic or what have you might continue to fuel options. But buyers already have a few more options, and that's already having a big difference in the marketplace. Don't let anybody tell you this is a market that's cooling. Nothing cool about today's market, but a little bit of supply does make a huge difference, right? We're still looking at 62% of closed sales on the left-hand side that sold for over list price, right? But it's no longer 75% of homes that are closing above list price, right? So not as quite as fiercely competitive as it was 6 months ago, where, again, not cool, but I joke that we're kind of not at the frothy, bubbling, white hot levels that we were at during the summer. We're just at the kind of plain old boring run of the mill red hot, levels. But I do think that represents an opportunity for buyers to get back into the game. You could see it days on market as well, right? That homes are still going pending incredibly fast, less than 2 weeks from hitting the MLS, but they're no longer going pending on median in less than 1 week after hitting the MLS, right? And so again, a little bit of a window of opportunity, particularly as rates are still, still fairly attractive, especially by my dad's standards, right? And so that's why even as prices are still near all-time high levels, what we're seeing is that, prices are now only growing by 13.5%, not 35% like they were during the summer. And so not normal, right? But kind of normal-er than we were before. And I think that is something that I think is good news. The thing I want to do at the last couple of minutes before they rip me off with the shepherd's hook is just talk about why you as an individual realtor can't throw your business in cruise control, even though we think the economy is going to be good and the housing market will sustain itself. It's because the structural challenges, right, where folks were being forced out of California have been exacerbated by this crisis. Our 2021 housing market survey shows an increase in the percentage of sellers who left California completely. This is a long-standing trend, but the increase in 2021 went up by more than it usually does, right? So this is a long-standing trend, but it's one that accelerated with the onset of the crisis. You can see the same thing if you look at sellers who sold their house and moved somewhere else in their home county. That number declined to less than a third of home sellers for the first time in the 16 or so years that we've actually been asking this question. And so those kind of incentives that were already creating, a giant sucking sound to, more inland areas, to other states, are only going to get worse as folks are able to continue working remotely. The Department of Finance numbers backs this up. We saw a increase in net domestic outmigration last year. We saw California's population shrink for the first time in recorded history. And I know that I say this all the time, but it really is because of our lack of construction, right? We project that construction is going to increase by about 20% this year when the dust settles on 2021. but that will still put us 60,000 units short of the state's estimate of where we need to be just to tread water on housing affordability, right? And think of the 180,000 units as how much we need to build just to kind of make the monthly interest payment on the credit card, right? Forget about bringing down the credit card balance that's built up because we've only ever built enough 5 times in the last 35 years. As you can see here, like forget about chipping away at the debt, right? Just to make the monthly interest payment, we need the 180, and we've been falling woefully short. On top of that, I think that's kind of why you see that even though, even the homes that we do have don't end up showing up on the MLS, right? We canceled out the kind of property tax disincentive with Prop 19, but you still see people living in their homes twice as long, right? Where are you going to go? You got a low rate, you got capital gains potentially that you're facing, and frankly, nowhere to move to because we never build enough homes. And that's why it's kind of the 1-2 punch for housing supply, right? We don't build enough in the first place. And then the homes that we do have, people hold on to with a kind of death grip because it's such a precious commodity these days. And that's why even with rates that my dad would have killed for this year, housing affordability was already getting worse. And now we're entering a period of time where rates are going to start going up. That's going to be the double whammy for housing affordability, right? We already had a huge gap with the rest of the United States when it comes to home ownership, which is particularly acute in segments of the population that are going to be extremely critical to housing demand moving forward. And that's why we have all these nasty records, which I won't belabor, but just, our outcomes when it comes to housing, rent burden, poverty, overcrowding, you name it, we're either amongst or at the worst in the entire country. And that is problematic, right? And again, you don't have to be a mathematician to figure this one out. When you go from a 25 million person state a few decades ago to a 40 million person state, give or take, today, when the number of realtors doubles over that time, when we build a third as much as we used to build, you don't have to look much farther than that to figure out why, even in a year with 15-year highs for closed sales and all-time high prices, that we really don't sell any more homes than we did almost 40 years ago, right? And so this has obvious implications for the marketplace, right? It leads to that erosion in housing affordability, the home ownership gaps that I already talked about, all of these things that our first-time buyers struggle with, that our clients struggle with in the marketplace, but it also has impacts on us as real estate professionals, right? Because the top 20% of realtors are doing better than ever, right? The market share of top producers has grown over the course of the last couple of years. In fact, the mean income of a typical or of a member of C.A.R. actually grew last year by 16%, right? If you add up all the commissions, you divide it by the number of members, that number's up 16%. And yet, if you look at the median income of a realtor, the highest producing all the way down to the lowest, you pick out that very middle earning realtor, and their income actually went down 17% amidst an environment of, again, 15-year highs for closed sales and all-time high prices. And so that rising tide has only lifted some boats. And that's why, even though I'm optimistic about the economy, you can see here a 4% increase in GDP, a 3% expansion in jobs. California actually outperforming even that with an almost 5% expansion in non-farm payrolls and an even bigger decrease in unemployment. When you superimpose that onto our housing forecast, we have home sales that, yes, will be above pre-crisis levels, probably about 420,000 units, but it won't be the 15-year high that we were enjoying that we kind of came into 2021 with, right? That those structural issues, namely the lack of housing supply, is going to prevent us from maintaining that 510,000 unit pace or even the 440,000 unit pace that we're currently at. It's all a supply game, right? We still see prices going up another 5% to almost $835,000, but that means that affordability is only going to get worse, particularly as rates start to rise. And so the good news is, things economically are getting better. The economic tide is rising. The public health side of this thing is looking up and up, right? We have a renewed passion for home ownership. Buyers probably want housing now more than ever, and the market's still a good one for sellers. We still think that rates are going to be a tailwind. Sales will probably stay above pre-crisis levels, and prices will probably keep going up. But the bad news is that kind of those supply chickens are kind of coming home to roost on us, if you will, because when we don't build enough, and when we have an increase in flexibility and work from home and all of that stuff ushered in by COVID, it kind of means that we have a lot more headwinds for first-time buyers. And that's particularly true when we think about an environment where rates go up even a little bit, right? I joked that my dad would have killed for these rates, but the thing my dad didn't have in the mid 1980s was, or in the early 80s, was $835,000 median home prices, which is what we're projecting this year. And so even little changes in rates have a big impact. And that means that ultimately there's going to be ongoing headwinds for home ownership. And that's before we even talk about all the industry stuff that's bubbling up there. And so even as, yes, we're optimistic that the tide is rising economically, and even within the housing market specifically, that rising tide only lifts some boats when it comes to the individual real estate practitioner. So what I've done for the past hour is tried to be her, so that to get you to be him. And I think that if we do that, you are in an environment where things are poised to get better, but you just want to very much have a kind of nose to the grindstone approach to your own business to try and get buyers back into the game, to sell home ownership and not just sell the home, and really also get proactive on the policy front when it comes to housing supply. So I'll leave it there and say thank you so much to Cindy and everybody for the opportunity to be here, and thank you so much for your time.
Jordan, could you check the chat real quick? There were just a couple of questions.
Oh, great. Yeah. Yes, Heidi, I will send these to Cindy right off. After I get off this call, you will have the slide deck, and I'll also make sure that we post those on CAR.org in case you need to find them later. Definitely. Robin asked, in our market, sales continue to exceed listings, and listing inventory continues to remain low, demand very strong, so prices will continue to go up. When will supply rise enough to curb rising prices? I think I don't envision a significant surge in inventory. I think the best we can hope for is getting back to pre-crisis levels, because the amount of inventory at some level, there's a ceiling on it based on how much construction we've done, right? We just don't have enough homes, period, for any significant surge in homes to be able to show up on the market. I think that we do see listings going back to like 2018-19 levels eventually as we get into the second half of 2022. But that will still represent a market with excess demand, right? If you go back to even 2018-19, we still had more buyers than we had homes to put those buyers into, and we were still seeing prices that were growing faster than incomes. And I think that will be the case. It'll just be kind of normal levels of excess demand, if you will, so that prices will be growing, at 5-6%, something like that, not 13-14% like we're seeing right now.
All right, Scott, are you still there? Did you want to say anything? And with that, Jordan,
just thank you so much, Jordan. We really do appreciate you being here and presenting great information. And now we can all use it in our business. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much. That was fun. I look forward to the next one. Hopefully we can do it in person next time.
Hopefully so, Jordan.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Take care.